fact, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to actually Google it and read you what comes up. This could backfire horribly, couldn't it? Wait there, because I've been thinking about that Buckingham Palace story, and I don't know if we're going to go in too hard on it today, because it feels as if we haven't talked about anything else since Wednesday lunchtime. Yeah, it's worked. I just Googled unconscious bias training, Daily Mail, right? Because I suddenly realised yesterday that all of the people who were, with a degree, I think, of justification, explaining that poor old lady Susan Hussey, it's an odd position to take, to come out of that encounter at Buckingham Palace feeling sorry for the person that inflicted the pain rather than the person that received it, but all of the people explaining that she didn't realise how offensive she was being. The phrase "she's 83" was trending on Twitter, and as I explained to you yesterday, that I could understand why, and there was room for an important distinction between explaining and excusing, but there was room for explanation. There was room for a degree of nuance, which we certainly managed to provide yesterday. But I am always intrigued, as you know, by the Gammon and Pineapple Party. I find them enduringly fascinating, albeit that my attempts to find some sort of depth to their thinking always fail, because there ain't any. I suddenly realised that what she needed was unconscious bias training. And yet all of the people who were queuing up to defend her on the grounds of not realising how offensive she had been were exactly the same people who normally have a fit of the vapours and clutch their pearls and talk about the woke mob whenever it's suggested that unconscious bias training is a good idea. Look at the Daily Mail, which also leads the line on trying to explain why Lady Susan Hussey is the real victim of this piece. Unconscious bias training must end, and I literally just Googled unconscious bias training, Daily Mail. Unconscious bias training must end, concludes landmark something, something, something. BBC tells its staff to watch out for 170 forms of bias. Employees feel they may have been the victim of unconscious bias. Oxbridge colleges ramp up unconscious bias and race workshops despite calls for them to be scrapped. Unconscious bias training for civil servants scrapped after something, something. Oxbridge spends £10,000 on unconscious and implicit bias training. Police chiefs continue to give officers nonsensical unconscious bias courses, including lessons on white privilege. Top colleges at Oxford are in the grip of unconscious bias training. Taxpayer-funded unconscious... This is incredible. I literally had no idea just how rich this scene was going to be when I Googled those 5 words live on the radio just 20 seconds ago. Taxpayer-funded unconscious bias training course urges MPs. England's cricketers lectured on banter by MP pay consultancy £7,000 to design unconscious bias. Can I press see more? Seymour Glass. Can I press see more? Can we do it? It's one page, just randomly entering the words Daily Mail unconscious bias training. No, I think we'll leave it. I think we'll leave it there. So, isn't that funny? That exactly the same sources, exactly the same platforms that are absolutely convinced that unconscious bias training is a waste of woke time, a load of woke nonsense, a confection of the woke mob, are exactly the same people that explained to us this week that poor old lady Susan Hussey was unconscious of her bias. So if someone has an unconscious bias that is bringing scandal and shame upon herself and her employer, is there anything that employer could do to make sure that nobody else on the payroll was suffering from unconscious bias? I'm just going to stroke my chin a bit and have a little bit of a think. So I've got this person, right, and they've got an unconscious bias. And if that unconscious bias is to pop up in the workplace, it could cause me and her and everyone she comes into contact with a whole heap of trouble and pain. How could we possibly avoid the impact of that unconscious bias that that person doesn't know they have? If only there was some sort of training that we could introduce. If only there was some sort of training. What would it be called, though? If you wanted to train somebody out of an unconscious bias, if you wanted to help somebody realise that they were nursing an unconscious bias that could potentially cause enormous pain to somebody else. A pain that, and I believe this to be true of Lady Susan Hussey, whether you like it or not, I'm afraid this is what I believe. She will be absolutely devastated to have discovered just how offensive she has been, because her bias was completely unconscious. So can you think of anything we could do? like anything an employer could do to make sure that there was no unconscious bias in the workplace? What would you call the training course? Unconscious bias. Oh, no, I'm good, but I'm not that. I can't think of what you would call it. If you wanted to have a training course designed to deal with unconscious bias, what would you call it? Oh, hang on, I've got an idea. Maybe you could call it unconscious bias training. But no, we can't do that because the Daily Mail has decided that unconscious bias training is a load of woke nonsense and absolutely ridiculous and a waste of money and time and energy, and it should absolutely be abolished. That's the same Daily Mail that's adamant Lady Susan Hussey was unconscious of the bias that even they concede she displayed when talking at the Buckingham Palace garden party the other day. Do you see the problem here? I'll warn you now, I've got a lot to say this morning. I don't think we're going to take a call before 10:30 because this is not an introduction to a conversation about Ngozi Fulani or Lady Susan Hussey. This is a conversation about bias that is conscious or unconscious, and it's actually going to be a conversation about Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. I'll show you in a moment how one story leads inexorably to the other. But just have a little think about that. Have a little think about that. You witnessed that live on the radio. It could have backfired. I was fairly confident I'd find at least one or two stories from one newspaper in this country carrying today a column or two dedicated to explaining why Lady Susan Hussey deserves our sympathy because she didn't understand how offensive she was being, something with which I actually agree. Not much sympathy, not as much sympathy as Ngozi Fulani, but some, certainly. We are decent people. And yet it's in exactly the same newspaper that I just found story after story after story after story after story after story after story denigrating, ridiculing, dismissing the very idea that people may benefit from unconscious bias training. So the latest example of how completely the editorial lines of right-wing newspapers and media organisations in this country, how the complete contempt in which they hold their readers and viewers and listeners is encapsulated by two very simple things. Number one, when somebody is unconsciously biased or unconsciously racist, it's very important to remember that they are unconsciously racist when mustering up sympathy for the trouble they've got into as a consequence of their unconscious racism. Number two, if anybody ever suggests that people would benefit from having a little bit of help in understanding the depths or the source or the reality of their unconscious biases or their unconscious racism, then that is something upon which we must come down like a ton of proverbial bricks. So I don't know how stupid they would have to think you are to believe that they can actually sell you both of these products, but they're selling them today. Today they're selling you the idea that unconscious bias is very real and important, and it's a reason why you must look with sympathy upon the 83-year-old woman that treated a black British woman as if she wasn't really British. That's unconscious bias. That's unconscious racism, and ergo you should feel sorry for the perpetrator of that unconscious bias. Press pause, give it a week. Story pops up about how an organisation, whether it's the Metropolitan Police or an Oxford College or the Civil Service or Sainsbury's, and they are doing some unconscious bias training for their workforce, and the Daily Mail will be back to telling you that it's absolutely disgraceful, absolutely disgusting, deeply divisive, completely woke, and utterly unnecessary. And yet in a vaguely logical universe, there is no earthly way upon which both of those positions can be true. They are telling you that unconscious bias exists when it's been done by someone they feel sorry for, but it categorically doesn't exist when it's been done in the hope of preventing these sort of problems from popping up in workplaces everywhere from Land's End to John O'Groats. And that is possibly one of the most important things I've ever explained to you. You're welcome.